All right, hello everybody. We're back for another round of notes here. We're going to look at domestically what's going on in America after World War II. And as you can tell by the title slide here, the American economy is going to fully recover from the Great Depression with just a little hiccup right after the war, which is always the case. And then we're also going to become much more conservative in this era immediately following the war, following a period of significant progressivism that we experienced under FDR during the New Deal. So whereas Truman himself is going to be a liberal, and his Fair Deal that we'll talk about in this unit will be an attempt to extend the New Deal, it's not really going to expand in this time period. It's also not going to contract tremendously, so America's not, completely moving back to conservatism, but we are seeing just elements of a more conservative America following the war. So prosperity and conservatism will be on the rise in this period we're looking at today. All right, so we begin by just talking about this general resurgence of conservatism and just how it kind of stems from, in large part, just a lot of things going on in America. War often makes a nation more conservative. You see that frequently throughout American history, like out of the American Revolution came the more conservative Federalist era. Out of the War of 1812, we saw which wasn't as significant a war, but we still saw the rise of Henry Clay and his era of good feelings, which tended to be a more conservative era with more support for things like the tariff and whatnot, as the National Republicans, later the Whigs, became a more conservative element of the old Jeffersonian Republicans. And then we're also going to see the Gilded Age as an obvious conservative response to the kind of progressive mindset of the Civil War era. We saw the Roaring Twenties after World War I, so you're seeing that following every major war, there tends to be this movement towards conservatism, and we're going to see it after World War II as well. So part of that is because of the problems that we face after the war, and frequently there are problems when you adjust back from a wartime economy and wartime society to a peacetime economy and society, and we're going to see that here. One of the first problems that is not necessarily going to be a stimulant to conservatism, but it's still a problem that needed to be addressed, is what we do with all the veterans. Over 20 million Americans had served at different points during World War II, and now they're coming back home, most of them. It was not automatically assumed that. Immediately following the war, we recognized the Soviet Union was going to be a threat, so there was a lot of discussion of leaving our army in Europe, leaving our army in Asia. And whereas we did leave elements of the army mobilized, we decided after a number of factors that we don't need to get into today, that it was wise to just bring everybody home. That was, or as many people home as was reasonably possible. And so large numbers of veterans are going to come home, millions and millions of them over the next 18 months, which is good news for families, but it's bad news for the economy as people don't quite know. What are you going to do with the veterans? Are they going to have a place to live? Are they going to have a job to go back to? But how do you adjust for this massive surge of people that are about to become possibly homeless and almost certainly unemployed, as many of the jobs they had are no longer there, and a lot of people feared we would very quickly go back into a Great Depression with this massive surge of unemployment and possibly homelessness. And so the government is going to try to respond to that. And the first thing they're going to do, and it's pretty significant, is they're going to pass in 1944, with a year to go in the war still, the Servicemen's Readjustment Act, which is going to create the GI Bill of Rights. So frequently when you see it discussed, you see it just referred to as the GI Bill. That basically is going to guarantee a number of things for these veterans returning home in an effort to try and soften the blow of all these people coming back and to help them readjust, as the law says, back to society. And the first thing it's going to do, it's going to give them 52 weeks of unemployment compensation at $20 a week, which wasn't like tons, but it was enough to kind of help them pay rent possibly and just to have some spending money while they readjust back, so they don't immediately turn to basically not having any money at all where they can't eat, or become homeless, because that can cause people obviously to suffer, and possibly in that state of suffering to turn to more radical means of meeting their needs, which is not good for them or for anyone. So that's going to exist. Another thing that's going to exist, it's going to try to provide loans to a lot of these people to possibly buy a farm or buy a house or start a small business. So that's going to be a pretty significant thing it provides for, as a lot of veterans are going to be able to buy homes for the first time. So men who grew up probably living in tenements or other types of housing like that, or just maybe poor, small-scale rural housing, are going to have the opportunity to buy a farm or buy a house, which was not very common back then. That was not really something that tons of people were able to do back prior to the Great Depression. But after the Great Depression, it's going to become much more normal. We have the programs from the Great Depression, like the FHA and USHA, that try to help people provide housing. But B, now we have this program where the government is going to back all these loans and loan money. And so that's going to help stimulate a wave of suburbanization. And then we're also going to see the third part, and this might be the long-term most important part, where it's going to provide tuition assistance for veterans so that they can go to college and develop their skills, which in large part, A, you want to help these veterans develop skills that will help them come back into our economy. But B, you also, by helping them go to college for 2 to 5 years, that's going to help kind of soften the blow of these people coming home. So they're not immediately seeking work. They're not immediately seeking a job, in which case that'll kind of lessen this need to find jobs for all these people and give the economy a chance to come back. But this is going to be one of the most important laws passed in U.S. history, and it's going to have some significant long-term consequences, because ultimately what happens in large part because of this law and because of programs that start from this law is we're going to start to see tons of people go to college for the first time. Prior to World War II, going to college was not really that normal. Very few people did it. There wouldn't have been programs like advanced placement because so few people ever went to college that you would need this type of education. And likewise, another thing is a lot of people are going to buy homes for the first time, like I said. So out of this, we have a lot of people going to college, developing better skills. They're going to lead to more of a white-collar service economy. Instead of becoming a factory worker, people are becoming accountants or business people or nurses or doctors or scientists or any of the other things that college can lead you, jobs college can lead you to have. And likewise, people are also having the ability to go buy homes in the suburbs and just create better living situations for themselves and their families. And so with this program, we're going to start to see large numbers of people enter this white-collar middle class that becomes a large part of U.S. society. And as people start to enter this, they're also going to start to make up for the fact that they've not had children in as high rates for the last 15 years, in large part because of the Great Depression and World War II, where we saw abnormally low birth rates in the Great Depression because people just didn't feel economically stable enough to have kids. And then World War II, because just so many people were, focused on the war, just separated because of the war, that there were just less opportunity to have an increased birth rate. And so with 15 years of a depleted birth rate and large numbers of people creating better economic situations for themselves and large numbers of people moving to suburbs where there's better living situations for themselves, we start to see the situation created that's going to lead to the baby boom. And the baby boom is going to be one of the biggest demographic shifts in U.S. history, as we all have heard the term boomer these days. And this is basically the era where that begins. These American citizens that are born, most history books would tell you between the years of 48 and 63, are considered the baby boomers. And in large part, it's because of this graph that we see over here, where what you have, if you look over at this chart in 1970, this is the percentage of people that were around during that time period at that age group of 10 to 15 in this bar. And notice you see how this thing that's supposed to be shaped like a pyramid, but then you have this dip. And this dip was the Great Depression and World War II generation, where there were abnormally low birth rates because of what we talked about. But now we're going to see this surge out here. Okay, and this surge is being driven by the things we're talking about now. But notice it's going to start declining again. And when you get back to this 0 to 5 age, when we're talking 1970, it's going to kind of level off here and then go back out. So we're going to have this huge bump following this huge divot, followed by another divot. And that's going to be this massive group called the baby boom. The baby boomers, we call them today. In which case, these people are going to continue to get older, as you can see in the chart from 1985, and they're just going to keep progressively working their way up. And as they work their way up, they're going to continue to change society. A lot of them are going to put a bunch of money in banks and stuff like that in this era here when they're in their 45 to 50 range. And that's going to help stimulate one of the massive economic surges we see in the 1990s as part of the dot-com boom, when a lot of these baby boomers have become professionals stable in their careers as they enter their 40s and 50s. And knowing that retirement was on the way, a lot of them are going to start dumping money into 401k. So basically, as you follow this group throughout their ages, you start to see the different industries rise up that support them. For example, today, medical and the healthcare industry is becoming huge because a lot of these baby boomers are now in this kind of 60 to 75 range, which means there's going to be more and more need of healthcare for them. So basically, it's going to create all this. One of the possibly negative consequences of this is programs like Social Security and Medicare that people will continue to predict will go bankrupt here in the near future, in large part because this massive surge is about to hit it. And as you can see below, these people that are roughly my age, we are kind of on this bracket, and we aren't a big enough group to provide for the needs of the group above us as Social Security. So we could go into this for hours and hours and hours. But long story short, this GI Bill creates a lot of the consequences that will be the baby boom and create just a lot of positives economically, positives politically, negatives economically, negatives politically, just the number of factors that happen when a society's demographics shift as much and as rapidly as they did here. Okay, another major problem we're going to see that will not have quite as positive an outcome is going to be the economy, because the economy does, in those first couple of years after the war, collapse. And why do we have this massive, massive recession where inflation is skyrocketing, unemployment is skyrocketing, GDP is kind of leveling off after many years of surging? Well, in large part, that's just what happens after a war. The economy and the society have to readjust. And during this readjustment period, there's going to be massive, massive changes. And these massive changes take time to adjust to. And so it leads to this major recession. But as we've experienced in our own lives, and will probably experience in the near future, sadly, it seems like these bad economies sometimes cause people to really reflect, which is a good thing. You want people to reflect on the direction of America and stuff like that. But they often turn to politicians who will promise to change everything, fix everything, as we saw with FDR in the Great Depression. We're going to see that in this era. But since we're coming out of an era of liberalism and progressivism with the New Deal, we're going to see how this leads to a massive conservative surge after the war, where it's, hey, we did all this progressive stuff, now the economy's bad for a couple of years, and now we need to fix it. So we're going to see a bunch of strikes as labor unions that have generally not been striking during World War II want to see their wages increase. We're seeing inflation, which we go into a lot of detail, but long story short, inflation goes up in those first couple of years by roughly 20% at different stages, which is just way too much. You want inflation to be more like 1 to 3%, depending on what's going on in the economy. At 20%, that's just unsustainable, and it's going to cause major problems in the economy. And so with all these problems, with striking workers and inflation and unemployment and just all the other problems going on in the economy, in the midterm elections of 1946, the Republicans are going to take office, and not just Republicans, not the kind of semi-progressive Republicans we saw in the New Deal, guys like Alf Landon and Wendell Willkie, but we're going to start to see more conservative Republicans like Robert Taft, the descendant of William Howard Taft, who's going to become a big force in the Congress and kind of the leader of the conservative wing of the Republican Party. And they're going to attempt, with very limited success, but they're going to attempt to kind of dismantle parts of the New Deal and dismantle other gains that have been experienced by progressive elements in society during the New Deal. And so this midterm election cycle is going to be kind of the end of the New Deal. We start to have a Congress that by 1938, the Congress was already a little more conservative. Now it's considerably more conservative. And so we're going to start to see changes where we're going to quit seeing the expansion of New Deal programs like we've been seeing throughout the 30s. All right, so one of those elements that's going to be a major plank in the platform of the conservative Republicans this time period is to kind of limit the gains made by labor unions during the 1930s. During the 1930s, we had things like the Wagner Act and the Fair Labor Standards Act and the NIRA, although that was ruled unconstitutional. And so out of that, labor had a lot of gains. There was a nationwide pledge of collective bargaining that was required under the Wagner Act. We had minimum wages, maximum hours, things of that nature. Well, the Congress is going to try to dismantle some of those gains, and labor is going to have some setbacks as a result. All right, one of the setbacks is not really the Congress. It was just how our economy was changing. In the post-war period, we're moving into an era where there's going to be a lot more white-collar service jobs. There's going to be a lot of shifts in America to different regions of the country. So where people used to live in the Midwest and work factory jobs, now they're going to move to the Sun Belt and work professional jobs or professional service jobs like medical or stuff like that. And those are jobs that don't necessarily need unions. The pay tends to be pretty good and whatnot. So just in the macro sense, a lot of the jobs that are easy to unionize, like factory work, those are going to start to go away here over the next 2 to 3 decades, whereas jobs that don't necessarily need unions, or at least are harder to unionize, like the medical profession or the business profession or the scientific field, they're not going to be jobs that need or have unions. And so in the macro sense, our economy is just changing to something that is not the same as what it was. Okay, sorry, I got by my bullet points there. Another element is going to be how we have Sunbelt migration. And what I mean by that, as you can see on this map, is a lot of people are moving from the Rust Belt, that's the part that's Pennsylvania through Wisconsin up there in the top, down to the Sun Belt. And the Sun Belt, even though in this map it only highlights California, Arizona, Texas, and Florida, it's really the whole region from Virginia through the Carolinas down to Florida, across to Texas, and up to California. So it's basically the big smiley face that runs along the southern part of our country, from Virginia down to Texas, up to California. And what's happening there is just a lot of economic developments happening in the Sun Belt. People are moving there for a variety of reasons. The number one reason is just the new jobs that are developing there in new industries like plastic and aerospace and electronics and other technology changes that are coming out of these massive technological developments that occurred during and after World War II. And so as people are moving there, A, they're moving to different types of economy, different types of jobs, I should say, that are not unionized type jobs. And B, they're moving to regions that have not had a long presence of unions. And so there's not laws and cultural support for unions like you see up in the more progressive pro-labor Midwest of Wisconsin, Illinois, Ohio, Pennsylvania, and Michigan. And so with that, unions do try to move south. We're going to see the CIO, if you remember, that was John Lewis's union of skilled and unskilled workers and industrial organizations that use sit-down strikes in the 1930s to try and become more influential, and helped unionize the United Auto Workers and get them a collective bargaining agreement with General Motors, and just all the things they did in the 30s. Well, in 1946, they're going to try to come down south in what they call Operation Dixie. They're going to try to move into the Sun Belt, and they're going to try to unionize things like the tobacco industry and the textile industry and just the other industries that are a little easier to unionize that are in the South. And in the post-World War II era, we see a lot of those industries continue to move south, like we saw in the 19-teens, 1920s, when some of them came south and stayed in the first place, like locally in places like Burlington or the Carr Mill in Carborough. Just a lot of these industries had moved, but they hadn't unionized yet. So the CIO is going to come down. They're going to try to unionize, but what they run into is a lot of opposition. The opposition is driven in large part by the fact that just there wasn't much support culturally for the unions because they hadn't had the long history of developing like they did up in the Northeast and Midwest. Another reason that the unions did not gain support was partly racism that existed in the South. The Southern mill owners would hire both white and black workers, and I probably don't need to tell you that there was a lot of racial issues and tension in the South in this time period. And so what would happen is the CIO would try to unionize a mill. Just sometimes in different situations, the workers would not get along or unionize or want to work together, in large part because of the prejudice that existed in the mindsets of many of the mill workers, in large part because of the Jim Crow society they grew up in. And that's largely, obviously, probably goes without saying, a lot of the white workers that don't want to participate in the unions with the black workers, as Jim Crow was just so much a part of Southern society, which luckily in the post-war era is about to decline significantly, but it's still not there yet. So because of that reason, because of other reasons that we mentioned, Operation Dixie is going to fail. The CIO is not going to be able to unionize in the South very successfully, and we're just not going to see large presence of union workers in the South. And so states in the Sun Belt are going to be some of the least unionized states in America, with the leader of that being North Carolina, who I think the last time I saw the stat, it's a couple of years outdated, I'm sure, only about 1.3% of our workforce in the state is unionized. But obviously that's a setback for unions and this more progressive view of labor. Okay, another thing that's going to be a problem for labor in this time period is the Taft-Hartley Act. And this is going to be the most famous law passed following those midterm elections of 1946, where the Taft-Hartley Act is going to basically be the more or less the complete reversal of the Wagner Act. Whereas the Wagner Act said you have to have collective bargaining, or at least offer collective bargaining rights to every worker in the state and in the nation, the Taft-Hartley Act is more or less going to undo it, where no longer are workers going to be protected by that. Workers are going to have what's called the right to work in every single state if the state chooses to do so. Which these right to work laws will be passed. They prevent employers and unions from developing collective bargaining agreements that require workers to be a part of the union or a part of the collective bargaining agreement. And there's a number of other things Taft-Hartley Act does, but the main thing is it reverses the Wagner Act, and it's going to weaken unions substantially, as it can no longer create these closed shop agreements that the Wagner Act created, where only union workers would be hired. And so that's going to be a major setback to unions. Another thing that's going to be a setback to unions, like we saw in the Roaring '20s, is the Red Scare. We're going to have a second Red Scare following World War II, and much like the first Red Scare in the 19-teens and 20s, Unions are kind of viewed as potentially communist organizations, in large part because both communists and unions support the working class, and so people kind of create these connections in their mind where they say that, well, a union must be communist, and so that's going to be a cause for people to not necessarily want to support or join unions, and so that's going to be a problem. Another problem is that unions during the early 1900s and into the 1930s and 40s, and after the World War II, some of the unions are going to connect themselves with organized crime. Probably the most famous example of that is going to be when Jimmy Hoffa, who becomes the leader of the Teamsters, and he's also a guy who was well connected to the mob. If you've seen what's that new movie on Netflix that just came out, but that, I think, if I remember correctly, it had to do with how Jimmy Hoffa was tied to the mob, and what was it, Robert De Niro played the mob liaison, and Jimmy Hoffa was played by Al Pacino. But long story short, it was basically covering this time period where Hoffa, as a leader of the Teamsters, one of the bigger unions for truck drivers, is going to be connected to the mob, and so and he becomes a celebrity, and it becomes very well known that there were these mob ties, and so that's going to cause a lot of awareness of this, and a lot of people are going to start to say, well, why would we support a union if they're just people that are connected to organized crime? And so the overall impact of all these things, in large part because the economy was changing, people were moving, we see laws in the government hurting unions, we see just the public perception of unions being weakened by both the Red Scare and by some of these ties to organized crime. Union membership in America is going to decline. So even though it's actually going to peak in the early 1950s, we're going to start to see these massive declines. So if you look at this chart over here, this is just a chart showing you the membership rates of unions in this time period, where they peak right after World War II, right after the New Deal gave all those gains. But then by the mid-1950s, we're going to start to see these declines until we get to the modern era, which this chart obviously stops around the year 2005, 2008, somewhere in there. But it continues to level off at about the 10% rate. So it was at one point almost a 30% rate of people in our country that worked were in unions. Today it's roughly 10, and it's basically a combination of all these different factors that eventually are going to cause the unions to lose their standing. The biggest cause is not listed here because it's going to be more a product that we see in the 60s and 70s, but it's also going to be that a lot of the industrial jobs, these jobs that are blue collar, not white collar, they're going to start getting offshore. They're going to start becoming a byproduct of globalization as we move them to Latin America or East Asia or Europe or just other places in the world where there's still a lower wage economy that can do the industrial manufacturing capacity that we used to have. And so as those jobs start to leave, as well as these other factors, we see the amount of unionized workers in America decline. And so what used to be a major force for progressive change in America, the blue-collar labor movement that we've seen since the Gilded Age, this blue-collar labor movement is going to cease to be that. And so we're going to start to see how more and more progressives focus on things like social issues, and there's less and less as we move in, especially the 1970s and 80s, less and less examples of more of a progressive economic mindset, as that was in large part a byproduct of labor movements and farm movements that are definitely weakening in these time periods. So out of all this, with these declining memberships, we are going to see the AFL and the CIO merge in 1955, where they become the biggest union in U.S. history, and the AFL, the Trade Federation, and the CIO, the industrial organizations, as they start to realize that the impact of all these changes is going to weaken the union. So the unions, in response to this, are kind of merging together to try and concentrate their resources and forces. And they're going to be headed by George Meany for several years, and he just becomes this leader throughout this period where unions are, in fact, declining. But either way, we've learned a lot about labor history in America, as it's been a heavily tested topic in the AP exam, as it's led to a lot of progressive change in America. But now, following World War II, we're beginning to see these declines that are not going to be reversed, as you can tell on that chart. All right, so in the midst of these changes that are occurring, we kind of had the bad economy of 46, 47, but it is starting to recover in 48, with the Congress becoming more and more conservative, with society starting to change. We are going to have an election, and this becomes kind of an important election, not because a lot necessarily comes out of it directly, although some very important things do, but it's an election that's just going to indicate what is the future trajectory of America politically. Are we a nation that is progressively moving more conservative? Or was the midterm elections of 46 just a byproduct of the economic hiccup, and America is going to more or less stay kind of a progressive society like we saw in the New Deal era? Okay, we start with the Democrats. Democrats were having some struggles. In large part, it's because the Great Depression is over. Whereas I think it's obviously a very good thing the Great Depression ended. The Great Depression was the thing that allowed Democrats to continue to hold power, as programs like the New Deal were very popular while the Depression was occurring. But now the Depression is over. And there were some changes going on for Democrats that are going to be, I think most of us would consider generally positive things, but there are also going to be political problems for the Democrats in this era, which we'll talk about. And one of those problems is Truman's platform, where Truman comes out as a very progressive Democrat in this era. And I think in large part it's because he saw America kind of beginning to shift towards a more conservative element in the midterm elections of 46. And he didn't want that, and he was kind of a fighter politically. And so he is going to go right for the throat and say, basically, America, we don't want to be conservative. We need to be more progressive. And so he's going to push something he calls the fair deal. And this fair deal is going to be basically a very progressive thing where he wants to increase federal aid for education. He wants to create things like a national health care system, like a single provider system, like you might hear Bernie Sanders talk about today. He wants to create programs, or if we're not going to do a single provider, he at least wants to create like Medicare insurance for older people. He wants to create affordable college programs, not just for veterans, but for everybody. He wants to increase the minimum wage rapidly. He wants to reverse the Taft-Hartley Act. So he wants to economically continue to be a progressive Democrat. In fact, a more progressive Democrat than even FDR was. But now we get to the part of the platform that's very significant, where he wants to support civil rights. Basically, he saw the black community have some gains during the New Deal. And some of these gains were causing a lot of black voters to become Democrat, large numbers. And so he wants to build upon that. And I think a lot of historians would tell you he also wants to not just do it for political purposes, but he wants to do it because he believes it's the right thing. So he wants to support civil rights. He wants to support lawsuits where he wants Department of Justice to support African-American plaintiffs in suing states and suing other entities that are limiting their rights and limiting their opportunities to equality and reversing discrimination. He wants to have federal anti-lynching laws. He wants to have federal anti-discrimination laws. And so these are things he wants to do as part of his fair deal. So he wants to support economic liberalism, and now he's starting to support social liberalism more and more. And whereas a lot of people would especially support elements of this program, it's going to be a problem for some Democrats. Okay, on the one hand, we're going to see the Dixiecrats rise up. And they're going to support a candidate named Strom Thurmond, and these were Southern Democrats. And if you remember from the 1930s, Southern Democrats always struggled with the New Deal as they weren't very progressively economically minded, but obviously Southern Democrats, if you look at the history of the time period, were certainly not progressively socially minded. So when Truman comes out as economically very liberal, that's a problem to them. But when he comes out socially liberal and standing up for things like civil rights, that becomes a major problem for Southern Democrats. Now, Southern Democrats are not quite willing to support Republicans yet, because Republicans aren't willing to kind of move towards an anti-civil rights stance, but they are willing to leave the Democratic Party. So they're going to create what they call the States' Right Democrat or States' Rights Democratic Party. But a lot of people just call them the Dixiecrats. And they're going to nominate a candidate named Strom Thurmond in this election. And Strom Thurmond was from South Carolina. He was a segregationist. He has a lot of limitations on his own prejudicial racial views. He actually was a senator from South Carolina till recent history. He was a senator almost to the age of 100, if I remember correctly, well into the 1990s. And then I think he died in the early 2000s, if I remember correctly. But he was a guy that ran for president promising to protect segregation. And so that's a problem. Another problem for Truman is going to be the progressive element. The progressive element did not feel like Truman was liberal enough, and so they're going to nominate FDR's old vice president from his third term, Henry Wallace, and they're coming out as the Progressive Party. And they're going to basically come out as outright socialists, saying, support for the economy is not enough. We need outright socialism. And so you see a Democratic Party that was already suffering some setbacks in the post-war period, and now you have the Southern Democrats leaving the party, and you have very progressive Democrats leaving the party. And whenever a party splits, that's a problem. And when a party splits three ways, that's basically unprecedented. So this should lead to the death of Harry Truman's presidency. But it doesn't. So what ends up happening? Well, Republicans are going to nominate Thomas Dewey. Thomas Dewey was the guy who ran against FDR in his fourth election, 1944, and he had the best showing of any of the Republicans, although he lost, obviously. But he was a New Yorker. He was moderately progressive in ways, but he was also moderate and conservative. He was considered charismatic and charming and good-looking, and he presented well on the developing medium of television that was just starting to become part of our society at this point. And so a lot of Republicans thought with the Democrats having all these problems, Dewey should be a good candidate. And in fact, people were so confident in this that, as you can see in this political cartoon, there's Dewey on the right talking to Truman, and he's saying, what's the use of going through with the election? All the polls are saying Dewey's going to win. And yet, Truman wins. And so what ends up happening? Well, Dewey obviously had a strong showing up in the Northeast and in some parts of the Midwest, where people were just ready for a change from Truman. But in large parts of America, especially the rural parts and some of these Sunbelt parts that are just now starting to develop a little bit, we see that Truman continues to carry the country. Now, as you can see, Strom Thurmond is going to carry large parts of the South, South Carolina, Alabama, Mississippi, and Louisiana, and a random elector in Tennessee. And that's going to be a foreshadowing of what's to come, whereas the Democrats, starting with FDR especially, become a much more liberal party, especially now that they're diving into social issues like civil rights. This is going to start to be a thing that's going to cause problems to Southern Democrats that are now going to start to say, I don't know that we can continue supporting the Democratic Party. And obviously this is going to be one of these big elections where the Deep South doesn't necessarily vote Republican, but a Republican leader who's willing to become more opposed openly to things like civil rights and leave the South alone on that topic is going to be able to kind of gain these voters in the South. And the guy who will eventually do that effectively is Richard Nixon. And we'll see that by the late 1960s, early 1970s. But in the meantime, the South is now starting to question whether it wants to continue to be aligned with the Democratic Party as it's moving into more and more liberal ideas. But at the end of the day, this election does show us that Truman obviously is still the president. He wins an upset victory that a lot of people were not predicting. And it shows us that a lot of people just aren't willing to give up on the New Deal yet. Whereas there's things that are people starting to question about the New Deal. The New Deal had a powerful force in people's mind that it made people feel very good. A lot of people still could remember the Roaring Twenties, remember how Hoover had kind of botched his handling of the Great Depression and burned a lot of bridges with voters that just weren't willing to vote Republican anymore, at least for now. Because of their memories of the Great Depression. And so the question then is, what will Truman do with this victory, albeit a divided victory where voters were kind of all over the place and obviously no longer quite as supportive of the New Deal as they were. And so we see this famous photograph that a lot of you have seen before. I believe it's in your textbook. Dewey defeats Truman, where the newspaper in Chicago had already printed and assumed Dewey was going to win. Obviously, the paper was wrong and there's Truman mocking them, but you get the idea.